The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for the first of an 8-part webinar series on Amoris Laetitia, brought to you by the Strong Catholic Families National Partnership, which is comprised of 4 organizations: the National Catholic Educational Association, the National Federation for Catholic Youth Ministry, the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, and the National Association of Catholic Family Life Ministers. I'm Andrea Kopp, Manager of Educational Resources for NCEA, and I'm happy to host this event for you today. We are proud to bring you this unique series reflecting on Amoris Laetitia and its implications to ministry. We would like to thank our sponsors, Paradisius Day, for helping to make the series possible. Hopefully you've had an opportunity to review the video provided by Dr. Tim Hogan in preparation for our discussion today. If not, I will include the link in the chat box for you to review later. We'd also like to thank RCL Benziger for sponsoring Dr. Hogan's Master Teacher video. Before we begin, please know that all of your microphone connections have been muted. If you have questions during today's presentation, please send those through the question box that appears in your GoToWebinar panel. To ask a question, use your mouse to click into the blank box area, type your question using your keyboard, and then click Send, where they will be added to our queue. Our moderator will pose your questions to the panel throughout the live session. The webinar presentation will last about an hour. Following the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a brief survey. I thank you in advance for providing us with feedback about today's programming. You'll receive an email the following business day with the webinar recording and a certificate of attendance. At this time, I'm going to turn things over to our moderator, Margaret Matiasevich, Executive Director at the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership. She'll get us started by leading us in prayer.
Thank you, Andrea. Let us take a moment to center ourselves as we gather the nation. Let us pray. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, in you we contemplate the splendor of true love. To you we turn with trust. Holy Family of Nazareth, grant that our families may never again experience violence, rejection, and division. May all who have been hurt or scandalized find ready comfort and healing. Holy Family of Nazareth, make us once more mindful of the sacredness and inviolability of the family and its beauty in God's plan. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, graciously hear our prayer. Amen.
Amen.
I'd like to thank you all for joining us today to discuss the newest exhortation from Pope Francis, Amoris Laetitia. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be serving as your moderator. Today I have with me a wonderful diverse group of ministerial leaders serving in the church. To get to know them a little bit before our discussion, I'm going to ask each panel member to introduce themselves by telling us their full name and their ministry. Michael, let's go ahead and start with you.
Yes, hello. I'm Michael Tyson. I'm the National Coordinator for the Strong Catholic Families Initiative and also serve as the Director of Ministry Formation for NFCYM.
Thank you, Michael, for being with us today. And Frank, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, Frank DeCiano with the Paulist Fathers, and I am in our offices, Paulist Evangelization Ministries, where I've been serving for the last 7 years.
Welcome, Frank.
Thank you.
Hi, Dan. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, my name is Dan Ryan. I'm Superintendent for the Diocese of Sioux City. Been here for 8 years and happy to bring a little bit of a school angle to this conversation.
Yeah, we thank you, Dan, for being with us. Roy, hello. How are you today?
Hi, I'm well. Thank you, Margaret. I'm Roy Pettifees, and I'm a licensed counselor specializing in working with teens and their families.
And we have Alice and Jeff together with us today, but maybe we'll start with Alice. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
It's great to be with everyone. My name is Alice Heinzen. I am the Director of the Office for Marriage and Family Life for the Diocese of La Crosse, Wisconsin.
Thank you,
and
Alice.
I'm Jeff Heinzen, the other half, and I am the President of McDonald Area Catholic Schools in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, and we'll chat a bit more about that later as to how that all presented itself when we were asked to attend the Extraordinary Synod in the Vatican in 2014.
Thank you. Thanks to each and every one of you for sharing your time with us today, and we look forward to learning from your expertise and wisdom in the various ministries you represent. To get us started, I'd like to just say, wow, Dr. Tim Hogan really provided us with a fresh perspective on listening. To remind all our attendees, the theme for this first session on Amoris Laetitia is listening. We will have two different panel discussions to unpack the content provided, and today is really about reflection, while the next one in October will be about application. So considering that, we're going to dive into a conversation reflecting on the concept of listening as presented in the exhortation Amoris Laetitia. When I watched Tim's video, I learned a lot of things, but I just wanted to remind us about a few things before we get started. He says, listening is important, but sometimes it can get lost as a value. And as I thought about that, I think it's often unintentionally. And he talked to us a little bit about the social psychologists and how they've assessed how stages of religious community form. And I think those stages are really going to influence our conversation today. The first stage he talked about was the raw experience of God, experiencing God in the messiness and the reality of your life. The second stage he talks about was coming together to tell your story with somebody else. The third stage is formalizing the sacred stories now of various people. And the fourth stage is talking about how the stories apply to life. And we often create laws and different applications. So as church, we utilize all these stages as entry points into the experience of sharing faith. But sometimes it's hard to know which entry point is the right one to start with. And in Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis is really challenging us to look back at that first phase, the raw lived experience of the other. So to begin today, I'd like us to remember that in our back of our minds as we can talk about this and unpack this content. And I'd like to start out with the South African greeting that Tim mentioned. Sobona, I see you. And I thank each and every one of you for joining us today. Now let's unpack the content. First thing we want to look at is Jesus is the model, really, of the concept of listening. We can see so many examples in Scripture. I'd like to just talk about the experience of Martha and Mary. Do you all remember the two sisters inviting Jesus into their home? They offered two very different approaches to how to greet a guest, specifically the wonderful guest of Jesus. We have Mary who sits at the feet of Jesus, listening, while Martha is busy preparing the home. You know, she's creating meals probably, you know, fixing the linens, cleaning the house, and Martha begins to feel extremely overwhelmed with all the work that she's doing to prepare her guest. And she's getting a little upset that her sister is just sitting and not helping. So she confronts Jesus, actually. She doesn't confront Mary. She confronts Jesus and she says, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. I kind of giggle at this passage because it reminds me of myself in prayer. You know, that we often come to prayer with the answer we want to happen. And Martha's done that here. She wants Jesus to tell Mary to come and help her. So she's screaming out. But Jesus can hear underneath her plea and underneath her anxiety. And he mirrors back to her her own worries, her own concerns. And he probably, you know, reflects her energy a little bit to her so she understands what she's doing. And he says to her, there are only a few things you need to be worried about. In fact, there's only one, and Mary has chosen it. She's doing the better thing. And what she's doing won't be ever taken away from her. And I think it's just so interesting, you know, that in all the hustle and bustle of trying to do what she thought was right, what she probably thought was the law or the necessary rubrics of what you do when you have a guest. And Jesus says, put all that down and greet me. Be with me. Listen. So I think, you know, we learn a lot about listening through the model of Jesus. And I think, Michael, you have another, probably a good example of Jesus serving as listener.
Yes, when I was listening to Tim speak, and one of the phrases he used was that the sacred gaze and the power of that just eye-to-eye contact, and the story that popped off the page to me around that was the story of Zacchaeus. You can imagine this huge crowded crossroads in Jericho where one of the roads leads to Jerusalem, and Jesus is on that road with his disciples, and there's Zacchaeus, who had everything but really nothing. He was definitely had some need, some deep need, some deep hunger that just money could not fill. And there in the midst of this crowd, Jesus stops, and of all the people he looks at, he gazes at Zacchaeus and says, "It's you, amidst all these others, that I want to have dinner with tonight." And while we're not privy to what was said at that dinner, we do bear witness to what happened as a result of that conversation that must have unfolded probably much past dinner time. But Zacchaeus comes back, and he wants to give everything. He's cheated the people out of their taxes. He wants to pay them back, but then that's what the law requires, but then he wants to go above and beyond that and give the rest of what he had to the poor who didn't pay taxes in the first place. So just the power of that transformation, the power of that, as we hear in the story of Emmaus, that heartburn, that transforms him into a disciple, because as we see down at the end of the story, he's following Jesus down the road, and we know that that's the road that leads to Jerusalem. So just the power of what that conversation must have been like to transform Zacchaeus' heart. And it all started with that sacred gaze that Tim mentioned.
Oh, true, Michael. Thank you. Lastly, I'd like us to consider the scripture story with the road to Emmaus as a great example for us to consider as Jesus as model listener. Alice or Jeff, or maybe both, do you think you could lead us down the road to Emmaus?
Well, this is one of my favorites because so here you got these two disciples. Their world has just been turned upside down with a raw experience. He's dead. What are we going to do? And I can just hear them mumbling as they're walking along, and all of a sudden this guy just comes in and goes, "Hey, how's it going?" "What do you mean, how's it going?" "Well, what's going on?" And in 2 or 3 simple questions, the Lord, who they don't recognize, starts asking them about their raw experience. And they're like, are you the only person around, the world that doesn't know what's going on? And Jesus kind of like, well, tell me about it. And Jesus listens intensely and lets them reveal their story, roll it out. And when I hear that story, I think often of, Jeff is great at servant leadership, but I don't know how many times as a wife I'll come home and he's like, "Well, what's going on? Well, are you the only one that doesn't know?" And well, tell me about it. And what a great listener he is to be able to help me reveal my story and my raw experience, which drives me forward into a deeper relationship with Christ and what I'm going through.
Jeff, don't you think it's interesting how Jesus takes his time to reveal himself? What do you think about that as far as our ability to learn from his posture of listening?
I think the real point in the experience that we've had in the last few years with the Extraordinary Synod and observing the master servant leader here on earth, being Pope Francis, you realize that listening is certainly an art. And I think in particular here in the United States, we're quick to we always want to fix it right away. And sometimes it's not really about the fixing, it's about the listening. And listening takes time. And we're not so much a society that wants to have time to just sit and be present to people. But at the end of the day, it is about those relationships. And when I think back to Tim's video that he did, and he talks about, God gave us 6 million faces. wow, we got a lot of work in us to sit and enjoy 6 million faces. And so I think that's one of the first pieces when we talk later about going forward. What does that look like? So the art of listening.
Margaret, you said, why did he take so long to reveal? Part of me is, when I think about that, it's because if he had revealed himself, he would have stopped them from telling their story. By hanging in the background and just being part of it, just kind of accompanying them, it was like they were able to just keep getting into it, and then they were like, oh, look who we've been talking with. So.
Thank you. That's a great segue into our next piece. It's about adjusting our posture. I think often as ministers in church, we're used to being in the posture of providing answers, like Jeff mentioned, solutions, or, but if we don't take time, like you just articulated, Alice, to really hear the whole story, how can we be sure that our presence and our, quote, solution is really meaningful? We might be missing a critical element of someone's sacred story. So I think the Emmaus story and Jesus as model listener is something for us to really pray about as we continue to unpack the document. But like I was mentioning, there's this critical shift in posture that Amoris Laetitia challenges us to. It's the posture of listening, to be alongside someone. But there's this mutual experience here, of Christ being lived, Christ being known, Christ being discovered together. And I think sometimes our posture is more that we provide Christ, and Amoris Laetitia is really bringing us down here to be alongside. And so we don't just listen to provide a response. We listen to see Christ in the flesh, to discover our own deep, loving response to Christ in the listening. And also we want, like Michael mentioned, this gaze of love. We want to provide that to another, but we also want to experience it from another. It isn't just one-dimensional. It's a two-way thing. It's a two-way experience. So, Roy, I'm wondering, do you think there's some insight that you can offer our group of listeners today? We've got quite a few out there about shifting the posture. How is that challenging, or what is that going to be like for us as ministers or as a church?
Yeah, and it is, and I think it's so important that we talk about the challenges. And I think one of the biggest challenges for all of us, and I know for me, and as somebody who listens all day long, it's my own ego. It's to move out of the giving position where I'm giving knowledge, or I'm giving wisdom, or I'm giving help, however you want to frame it. And move into that alongside position, as Pope Francis invites us to, where we accompany, is to move out of giver to giver and receiver. And that's a tension that our natural ego doesn't like, especially for those of us who are ministers, who are servants. We want to give. And, and part of it is being mindful of that. That does stroke our ego a little bit. And I know it doesn't necessarily sound good on this webinar, but it's true. And when we name it and put it out there, it has much less power to rule the day and to govern us. So yeah, just to know it, and that it's humbling to move into that alongside position and to receive, and to look at the other with what has been so often referred to as the beginner's mind. That I get out of my expert position and that I move to the beginner learner accompaniment position, which is because no one wants you to be an expert on their life. My clients come in, even when I was a teacher, my students didn't want me to be the expert. No one wants us to be the expert. Everyone wants to be their own expert. They don't want to feel that vulnerable, and nor do we. And so that's the posture that I go into it with the beginner's mind, that this person has a gift from me, that if I listen and that I walk with them, that I can learn from them, and that I can receive from me, and that what can Christ do in me? How can I be helped even as I give? And so I think that's the posture, that's the framework or the paradigm, I think, that can be very helpful for us and helpful for the folks whom we serve.
Oh, thank you, Roy. I think that being an expert on someone else's life is the tension. You know, that often when we start with that stage of maybe law and procedure, we think that we're an expert on how to move someone to the next stage in their life, where we aren't. You know, we have to listen and understand and journey alongside. Thank you. Dan, I know you have a vast experience of working in the church. How have your experience been informed or influenced by such a shift in posture, of maybe the listening posture?
Well, Roy's comments definitely lead me right into what I was thinking, in the sense of a story that I have from a priest who had worked with us a couple of times. His name is Father Krupp, and he's from Michigan. And he'd come down and done a retreat with our administrators and learned a good amount about us. And he came back and did another group of teachers retreats, and we were talking at a break, and he was talking about some of his concerns there, and we were talking about some of the things that he knew we were doing, and he made the statement to me. He said, I see the need for centralization, or I see the need for us to work together between, say, parish and chancery, or school and chancery, and those sorts of things. He goes, but it doesn't work. And that comment, you know, really kind of hit, I think, some of what Roy is talking about there, because sometimes we're taking that expert role or that leadership role, and we're not really including everyone in that. And so kind of what I say back to that comment now is, you know, we need a lot of working together, or that knowledge, but we also have to have a lot of local input. And so what that means to me is we've got, you know, a chancery and a school, or a chancery and a parish, different groups. And again, just like Roy said, not the expert, but walking together and realizing what gifts each of us can bring to the process and what we're trying to do. And another example that kind of comes to my mind is something that we were fortunate to do here, that we knew we needed a strategic plan for the diocese for schools, and that we had really needed to take those roles. But one of the things that came out of a conversation with a group of leadership administrators at principals was the fact of, well, that's great if you have a plan, but what's our plan, and how are we going to work together? And so that ended up meaning that we didn't have 1 year of planning. We had 1 year of planning for the Catholic Schools Office, or the diocese, if you understand what I'm saying, and then a year of planning for the local schools that we helped lead. And that way we were able to work together and realize, hey, there's certain things that, hey, the superintendent can do, but there's also a lot that, you know, the principal has to do. I cannot accomplish. So really working together and benefiting each other. And I think that's the key thing that I took away from Roy's comments, of really, we need to look at our spaces and our relationships, but we need to have a mindset of, like Roy said, of walking with them, or we're walking with each other, and realizing what gifts each of us has. And I think that's what everyone's been saying in their comments, of that Jesus does so well when he's listening. That's the first step. Listen, then find out how is it we're going to work together.
I thank you, Dan, for coming from that perspective of the Chancery Office. I think a lot of folks online serving in diocesan positions can understand what a big shift in posture that might be, you know, for some of our leadership, to really look and listen to those whom we're all looking to serve. So whether it be families in our Catholic schools or those in our religious ed programs, coming up with a strategy just from the diocesan perspective and the Chancery Office doesn't necessarily mean it's speaking to the reality of the lives whom we're hoping to touch. I appreciate you bringing in that perspective. I think that's really unique, so thank you. So as you all know, I mean, our church is so vast. We're hearing about the Chancery Office. We have, you know, folks that work in psychology and youth ministry and diocesan perspective, as well as family life. So we have such a great panel. But even how we model listening and the posture of listening at a church is also varied, you know. So look at something as basic as, not basic, but as beautiful, I guess, as our liturgy, something we experience regularly. We've really accentuated that posture of listening when we proclaim the word, right? We listen. And we don't just listen to the proclamation, we sit in the silence and we listen some more so that we can really understand what's stirring, you know. The Synod is another great example of how we listen as church. You know, the Synod comes from the Greek word meaning walking together. And to be effective, it requires a great posture of listening, because what the bishops do when they gather at a synod, they gather from all over the world to thoughtfully reflect on topics that are affecting the large church. And of course, culture and experience is going to influence the perspectives of our great grand church. So having a synod model and a regular experience of gathering together globally is really a way our church honors the posture of listening. And we're so grateful that Alice and Jeff are bringing their experience with us today of attending the Extraordinary Synod on the Family. And I'm wondering if the two of you might be able to speak a little bit about what it was like, being alongside the Holy Father in the posture of listening, but also for you as participants. Can you inform all of us what that experience must have been like?
You sit even today yet, and it was a very emotional time for us. First of all, you live in northern Wisconsin, and you're plucked out of how many million people from the North American continent. So we were the couple from the North American continent. What did we do? How did we get there? I mean, the paparazzi that was in Europe while we were there, of course, wanted to, how did you get selected? I said, your clue is as good as mine, and was certainly a moment of Holy Spirit work that was very obvious to us. But coming into the Synod and then watching the process that Francis demonstrated for us right from the get-go, which I remember the first morning, we're standing in the common area.
Yeah, outside of the room.
Yeah, outside of the meeting room, and all of a sudden, bishops and cardinals are flying up these two circular staircases, and we're going, so what's going on? Well, the Pope's in the hall. And this rumor's kind of flying across the room, the Pope's in the hall, the Pope's in the hall. We're like, so, okay, what does that mean? Well, that's not how it goes. You see, it was supposed to go that we all go into the room, let's say at 9 a.m., and then the Pope enters with the pomp and circumstance. No, that wasn't how it went. He was at the door greeting everyone individually and welcoming us. The accompaniment started from the first moment.
I wish that we had they took a picture, the Vatican Press Corps took a picture, and seriously, the look on my face, I don't think I was that happy the first the Holy Father welcoming you in with such grace was amazing. But then the entire 2 weeks that we were there, the focus was on not what we wanted to say, but what were we receiving? What did we take in from the 13 other married couples, and then all the bishops and the cardinals and the other laity, and then the other priests. Yeah, we came home with literally pages of notes that we took, because we wanted to not only receive but be affected by what we received. It's not just a matter of taking it in and going through the, okay, I'm going to look at you, I'm going to respond with what you're saying, I'm going to repeat it, blah, blah, blah. It's about actually taking it in and going, whoa, what do I do with this now? How does this change my reality based on what I've been given? And the Holy Father only talked with us twice.
Yeah, he spoke the first day when he gave us the instructions, which was, this is as if we were at the dining room table, and you will tell me everything. I need to know everything. And then it was nonstop listening on his part for 10 days. And then at the end, if you read the closing statement that he made, it was just incredibly powerful, and really worth people going out to the internet and downloading that closing comments at the Extraordinary Synod. But literally during that entire time, he sat and just was attentive to each individual or each couple who was speaking, and was taking his notes, and just an incredible experience. And then to literally clear his calendar, and I've shared this in some of our talks, what CEO in the world stops everything and is with you from 9 o'clock in the morning until 6 or 7 at night, And when you're on coffee break in a room with 200 people, and we've all been in those kinds of meetings, he's right there. You're stunned, first of all, you know, and then you kind of realize, no, he's here to listen. And people would come up and share thoughts and ideas, and you know, those are the moments that are burned in your mind.
I suspect he gained a lot of insight from those dinner-type conversations you described, because in reading Amoris Laetitia, the language is really real. You know, it speaks to the truth of some painful realities of our families, but also some beautiful realities as well. But just to name some of the frank realities that he names, you know, I can quote a couple of pieces of the document. He says, in many cases, parents come home exhausted, not wanting to talk, and many families no longer even share a common meal. We know this. I mean, I'm a busy mom. It doesn't mean I don't want to share a meal. It means I'm tired, and I'm exhausted after a long day of work. You know, he also says, quote, drug use was also mentioned as one of the major scourges of our time, causing immense suffering and even breakup in many of our families. The same is true of alcoholism, gambling, and other addictions. How often have we heard vices presented in a way to adjust our posture, you know, in a church document like this? It's amazing. And he says, this is often the case with families where communication is lacking, defensive attitudes predominate, the members are not supportive of one another, family activities that encourage participation are absent, the parental relationship is frequently conflictual and violent. Wow. And relationships between parents and children are marked by hostility. Violence within the family is a breeding ground of resentment and hatred in the most basic human relationships. You know, I think often as ministers we assume that if we offer the solution, you know, the law piece or the procedure piece, that people are going to recognize it. You know, and I think this document really challenges us that we can't assume people have ever experienced what we're offering as the solution. And so to start in a place of perhaps law or procedure that demonstrates a God of mercy, but maybe in a very rigid fashion that you have to maybe go through the sacrament of confession, might make people so vulnerable to the foreign experience that they might instantly push it away. It's not meant to be rejection. It's just demonstrating a lack of experience, perhaps, in what it means to know mercy in your life. You know, if he's talking about these frank realities of our families, which I know we all know we've experienced, either in our own families, in our circle of friends, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our church. And I think we have to really adjust our posture to not assume people know what we're offering when we're saying, come believe in this guy, Jesus, you know, come experience. We have to really model that and provide that. Frank, I'm wondering if you could speak to some of the challenges that Amoris Laetitia offers us and how we listen. You know, what does that mean for us as church?
I think there is no document that's been issued by the church that has the humanity that Amoris Laetitia has, you know, talking about listening. And as I'm reading this document, I'm trying to imagine how much pastoral listening this man did just to comprehend the situations of family. And I'm thinking of him in Argentina and people grabbing him over here, or him sitting down or listening when he went to work on the bus. And it's just so rich in human experience. And that experience is, as you just noted, very beautiful and positive, but also filled with difficulties and conflicts. In a variety of ways, all of us have talked about the importance of conversation, whether it's on the diocesan level and how they're relating to parishes, the parish level, how they're relating to people, whether it's a therapist dealing with a client, whether we're working in organizations, etc. How we have conversation and how we listen is an essential part of the process of conversion. The Pope, you know, just understands that people get stuck And then he has that remarkable line, which I think is one of the most evangelical lines when you think about what Jesus did in the gospel. He says, people can't be stuck forever. And there's this sense that, through listening and through dialogue, we help people on journeys, and in doing that, we help to unstick them. And so without in any way compromising the ideals and the values, because he's very clear about that, and looking at the whole magisterial repertoire, if you will, and talking about our values around marriage and family and sexuality. He says, but then you have the reality in which this is lived, and that reality is frail and contingent, and how we have to understand not the ideal, but how that ideal becomes real or can become real given the particular limitations and framework of one situation, one person, one family, one point in time. And I think there's just a marvelous pastoral insight, because we all want to pull out the catechism, we all want to pull out the code of canon law. Here it is in black. It's not here it is in black and white. Here it is as an encounter with Jesus, calling us to a set of ideals. This Jesus who knows the limitations of our hearts. And we as ministers of Jesus have to know those limitations as well.
Thank you, Frank. That's good to lead into our last part of our panel discussion. Just to notify the audience, after we go through this last piece, we'll be watching a little video from our sponsor and hopefully replying to some questions in the chat box. So keep them coming. So our last topic is about barriers and solutions. Tim Hogan presented us with a question that we will seek to unpack in this last section. He says, what are a few of the biggest barriers, structural, practical, theological, that get in the way of the church becoming a real listening church? And I know we just heard from Frank, but I think he'd be good to offer some wisdom again on the role of conscience formation. The Amoris Laetitia mentions that quite a bit. I mean, the word conscience is all over the place. How does listening play a critical role in conscience formation, Frank? What do you think?
Well, conscience formation is really the formation of our hearts and minds around those values that are unbreakable and forever, namely the values of God and the value of God as that is communicated to us in Jesus Christ. And so the primary way of forming conscience is where we are in dialogue with Christ, with our hearts as open as they can be, and how Christ is leading us to see the infinite love of God, which is the norm according to which all of us are judged, and how we can open our hearts and let God move us closer to that absolute. And I think the image of journey here is very important. We've used that. You used it when you talked about synod, the road we take together. We're all on a journey, and here's the road. It has a beginning and the end, but we're all in different places along that road. And some of us may be a little faster, and some of us may be a little slower, and sometimes we're coming up a hill. And I think parents who deal with teenagers, adolescents, know I have to pull them up the hill sometimes. And sometimes when we're dealing with our aging parents, we know we have to help them along as well. But we're all in different places, and conscience is the way in which we continue to orient ourselves toward the goal of the journey, the goal of that path, and how we can move fuller and fuller toward that. You think about every Sunday I'm hearing the gospel, but I never hear it the same as the last time I heard it. And that's the phenomenon of conversion and gradual conversion and gradual enlightenment that is part of the Christian process.
And again, it accentuates that posture of listening, the proclamation and then what's stirring as a result of the proclamation and the hearing again of the good news. Roy, do you think you could give us some insight on individual prayer and perhaps discernment and how listening plays a role in that?
Well, I walk very tentatively in trying to offer any insight on personal prayer, since it's something that I know we all struggle with, and and I certainly do as well. But I think a real barrier a real barrier can be for listening is that very often we don't listen to God speaking in our own hearts and in our own lives and the context of our lives, and even through our own story. But one of the dangers, as Steve Angrazano reminds us, is that we have, as ministers, we have these near faith experiences, sometimes at the risk of having faith experiences, and God's constant invitation to us is to not only listen to who we're with, but that He wants to speak to us directly in our hearts, and we, and that's why I think our own personal prayer life, which we often resist because we come face to face with how messy we are, with how many contradictions that we hold within ourselves, the parts of us we like, we don't like. We can feel hopeless in the face of our sin and in the face of our brokenness. But if we dare to stay there long enough, we'll hear God continuing to beckon us forward and say, despite your sin, even with your sin and your brokenness, please come forward. Please share all of who you are, your gift and your grace. And I think as we hear God's voice in prayer, because discernment is not a static thing. It's not like we have discerned. Well, I've discerned God's will for my life. Well, I've discerned God's will for my life today, and maybe a few days, but it is a dynamic, fluid process that we must always be listening here. And the good news about listening is whether I listen, it doesn't matter which door you enter in through, whether you enter in through the door of your heart through prayer, or you enter in through the door of listening to another. You can hear God in both places, and both, they're reflexive in that they both help one another. So hopefully that helps.
Really true. Yeah, thank you, Roy, so much. I think part of our call as ministers is to help people nurture that skill. Often the messiness of our lives gets termed as not a place to discover grace. Alice, can you speak a little bit about how maybe we as ministers can assist people in discovering grace in their lives? The posture of listening.
I agree with what Frank said, that, we're all on a journey and that the path is there. After attending the Synod, I kind of took a little caveat on that we all have our starting spot and we all have an end spot. But the path we take is very, very different. It might not even be the same path that, Jeff's on one, I'm on another. It's very different. And some people will do that expedient, if you will, the interstate path right to the finish line. And they just have it all together. And others get lost on the county roads. And we have to understand that because we're all uniquely created in God's image and likeness, we all have that unique way that we're going to get there. And one of the most grace-filled, merciful actions we as ministers of the church can do is to trust that God's plan for that person is theirs. And that's why we're at their side, instead of forcing them all down the same way. Right now we have a Ryder Cup that's being played in Minnesota, all right? And if you look at how very few people are on that course that can actually go from the tee box and in 2 strokes, get in regulation on a green and putt and everything else, it's very few. Most play like I do. You go from the tee box, you go into the rough. From the rough, you go to the sand trap. You visit every, corner of it, because that's my path to the end. And I love it when my caddy, well, ha ha ha, caddy, but when the people I'm playing with, you can still do it, Alice. I know you can get out of that sand trap, and they're encouraging me at my side. And I think that that's just something that we need to remember. They're not all going to go through the same pigeonhole on the same path, which means as ministers, it's like herding cats, isn't it? And that means we've got to put more time into being rather than doing.
But Dan, don't you think we have some inhibitors to that process? I mean, what do you think about the position of judging? Isn't that
Well, I think...
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I think that one of the things we encounter in our ministries is a rush to judgment. And again, I'm kind of building off of Frank and Alice and even Roy. But if you're starting with judgment, that really becomes a problem. And again, all my analogies are about schools and classrooms. But, you know, sometimes we say it's really easy to teach second grade. I love the content. I can read better than they can. I can do all the math. I can write sentences. I can do all of it. But the trick is that you actually, it's really hard to teach second graders because they're not all at the same reading level. Some are at third grade, some are in kindergarten level, and you're trying to meet all of these different kids' needs, and that's kind of that messy part there. And so if we stick with, well, this is the content and this is what I'm going to teach, well, that's not going to get us to move forward, or it's not going to take, a little bit like Alice said, we're not going to move every student or every person as far forward as we can. I mean, that's really our goal in the classroom and in our ministries and in our life. So I think it's just really essential that, you know, we approach it from a problem-solving mentality, and that we really are moving out of a state of sin, because we're all in that state, and that we're trying to do the best that we can to get away from that and get towards the grace of God, if that makes sense.
It does. Okay, we're running low on time here, folks, but I have 3 more concise responses that I'm hoping to get from the panel. It'll start with Michael, and then I'm going to go to Jeff, and then I'm going to end with Frank. Okay, so I'm putting you all on the spot so you know you have about, a minute to offer me a cohesive, good response for our listeners today, because you all have been so great. But Michael, I know with your experience with strong Catholic families, there's a lot of information that you've gathered regarding how do we listen to people's lives, and despite all the challenges we might have as church, what insight can you offer our listeners today?
Sure. Well, I mean, I just really, one of the best insights that we gleaned from the whole Synod process unfolding over several years was when they decided to survey people and ask what's going on and what do you think. We kind of took a cue from that with Strong Catholic Families, and we decided to do a survey ourselves. We took 12 statements that parents hear from the church all the time in various ways, and we just put them out there for them to tell us which are the most meaningful statements that you need to hear right now as a parent. And the results were not too surprising, but very validating for, I think, anyone involved in ministry in any level. The top 2, by far, number 1, 63% said they need to hear, "You are always welcome at our church." And the number 2 response was, "How can the church help you and your family live out your faith in the world?" I mean, those 2 statements, by far, both of those were above 50%. Nothing else came over 30% in terms of a response. So in terms of discovering a starting point, people are saying to us that they need to be welcomed and received, and they need for us to take the posture of servant leader, to say, not what you can do for us, but what can we do for you? What are your strengths? What are your gifts? How can they be put to use? A couple of comments that came in from that survey from parents said, most parents are trying their hardest and they need support, not condemnation. Another said, meet us where we are at and help us encounter Christ. A third said, get to know me, my spouse, and my family first, then help us on our faith journey. So these are the critical starting points for leaders, and I think Francis has been modeling that in his papacy and at the Synod as well. And it really reinforces what many of us have learned from all the Gallup research out there about the fact that belonging leads to believing. If we want to lead people toward the good news of Jesus Christ, we have to help them feel like they belong first. And that's validated in this first step, or this that we take in this posture of listening. So it all starts and it comes back to the listening as validation of who they are and where they are.
Thank you, Michael, so much. That's so good to hear that honest feedback from those that we hope to serve. So Jeff, what do we do next? Where are we called? Any recommendations?
I'll give you 3 words. These came out of our flight home and hold true, I think, even today. I've heard that conversation here a lot. And the first one is to accompany. To simply be present. Second is to do that affectionately. Not the way we think of it here in the United States, which is, oh, I love you. No. To be affected by what the person says and in turn affecting them. It's only in that process of being affected do we come to truly see the face. Okay. And ultimately, if we're accompanying affectionately, we can then walk towards the truth with the families, or accountability. So accompaniment, affection, accountability. We're at a point, there's a famous gospel story where, the shepherd goes out to find the sheep, and it's one, because there were 99 there. And today we look in the church, and that one's there because we did such a good job, but where the heck are the 99? So we need to go out, okay? And so those, I think, are the things. And teaching ourselves how to accompany, that's the challenge. That's a piece that we really need to spend time working with people on. How do we simply accompany? That's step one. And of course, in servant leadership, that scenario is laid out very well. So there's my 3 words.
Those are really good. Good for us to consider and continue to unpack. They're very simple but complex, if that makes sense. They're layered as far as our ability to apply them. So lastly, Frank, I think all of us are feeling a little overwhelmed. I think we want to be perfect at this listening posture, and I know in Amoris Laetitia mentions a lot about gradualism, which we alluded to throughout our conversation, but that folks move at a certain pace. All of us do. This is a whole journey of discovery. What advice do you have for us that are feeling overwhelmed to do this perfectly? What do we do?
Right. Well, when Jesus invites us to be perfect, he invites us to be perfect like the Heavenly Father, whom he just described as generous, forgiving, loving, merciful, open, forgiving. And so I think sometimes we can get hung up by everything has to be perfect, everything has to be right, I have to look good, the church needs to look good. And what we really need to look good about is the way Jesus shows us that the reality of God. You don't have the infinite being, you have unlimited love. And how we communicate that through the frailty of our own limited but authentic love for others. So I kind of look at this and I say, let's open the doors and let's open our hearts. And then let's see what happens. There are so many people that have already predetermined what we're like and what we look like and how we're going to speak to them. And the Pope has given us permission to alter that perception and to find ways to do that.
Thank you, Frank. And I think Andrea now is going to take us to a word from our sponsor, and we'll come back for probably a couple minutes responding to some questions in the chat.
From the makers of Batman Is You, one of the nation's fastest growing men's programs, comes an all-new program.
in this room right now, we have over 5,600 years of married experience. I want to ask us our first survey question, and that is, how hard is it to remain happily married? There's someone laughing already. Yeah, that wasn't one of the jokes, okay? If you do those 7 things, those steps are going to divorce-proof your marriage. And I mean radically lower the probability that you'll get divorced. In this survey, the answer is 0. And when I say 0, every single one of those people had never been divorced. See, Christ doesn't want your marriages just to have enough. He wants your marriages to be super abundant. To unpack that depth in these 7 simple steps, we're going to use everything we have at our disposal. At times, we're going to stretch your mind with some of the most amazing science you could ever imagine. And we're going to test your faith. We're going to challenge you to live your high calling. We're going to tug at your heart in pretty much every session. So yes, it's okay to bring Kleenex.
3 months into the pregnancy, I sat her down for lunch and said, I'm just not ready to be a dad. I think I'm probably going to leave you.
And so it was a difficult time for us.
I literally died, and 1 second later I was standing at the gates of heaven. And the light in heaven is awesome because God is light. God illuminates heaven with his own glory.
He wants us to experience superabundant choice wine.
I've been yours for longer than you could possibly imagine. I've loved and respected you since before you had a face. As we give each other everything tomorrow, let's give each other the promise of heaven as well. I have waited, and I am so glad that I do not have to wait anymore. I love you.
Live the love. It's real. It won't be easy, but it will be worth it.
Panelists, you're back on.
Thank you, Andrea. Michael, once he comes on, back on the screen, I'm going to ask Michael to respond to one of the questions in the chat that caught his attention. Ready,
yes,
Michael?
Well, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I think a lot of questions sum up with, okay, this is all great stuff, but I'm leaving this webinar. What can I do? Give me a place to start. And really, all the research that I've come across in terms of passing on the faith, and especially as it revolves around families, really comes down to this. It's helping to teach our parents, adults, and children how to do intentional discourse, how to dive deeply underneath just conversation to do what we would call in the Catholic tradition theological reflection. It's all about connecting faith with life, which is what Jesus did in throughout his ministry. It's connecting the daily events of life with our faith and our beliefs and trying to make those connections. So I think helping to not just teach, but to model whenever we're gathered with parents, with families, with children, to spend time in faith sharing and asking the question and helping people to look for the answers to where was God in all of this? What was God saying to us through this encounter, through this moment, etc.? And really the research says if we can do that as a family on a daily basis, it will assure that faith with our children will be passed on in that next generation.
Thank you, Michael, so much. You know, there's an interesting question that I saw in the chat. I'm sorry to rush between, but I want to make sure we get to a few of these about digital formation and how do we be in the posture of listening through digital tools. You know, as a mom of 2 little ones, I'm often challenged by their experience. You know, it's nothing like my own when I was their age. So my 6-year-old and my 10-year-old are used to talking with Grandma and Dedo, which is Grandpa in Croatian, through FaceTime. They're used to sharing intimate stories and experiences with another and building relationship through digital forms. So I think we have to listen to the experience of our younger people, our digital natives, because their experience of living is really far different than our own. So again, to come from our own procedure and law perspective might not always be the most meaningful depending on who we're serving and what their experience has been. So I think we're going to be really challenged in how do we assume the posture of listening to the lived experience of young people who have formed relationship in ways that we didn't, at least my generation didn't, through technological means or digital means. So I think we have a real duty to listen carefully and also to practice new methodologies ourselves for communicating using digital means and understanding that, you know, like social media isn't just about responding. Again, it's that posture of listening. You know, so how do you use social media in a way where you're listening to what's going on in your friends and your community, and how do you assume the posture of listening rather than having immediate response, but maybe more of a reach out and I'm thinking about you and I saw this post or whatever. You know, I think we have to really apply new skills. Lastly, for anybody on the panel, there's a lot of discernment questions, so I just thought I could throw that out as one single question. How does Amoris Laetitia, you know, really challenge us as far as our own discernment in listening and prayer? How do we know when we're hearing God's will and when we're just hearing our own voice, kind of like the Martha experience, you know, praying with the hopeful response that she wanted? How do we discern when we hear God's voice versus our own?
I'm just going to add, I think that preceding that discernment piece, one very practical thing that I came away from after being at the Synod was simply anytime a person was talking to me, to have a very thoughtful gaze into their eyes as they were talking, instead of looking around or being distracted or, you know, holding the phone. But that allowed me to, if you will, draw them out a little bit, so I had more to receive. And it's interesting because when people look at me that way, when I go to my prayer time, I feel like I can be more vulnerable with God, because someone on the face of the planet actually took the time to look at me as I imagined Christ would look at me. And so it makes it easier for me to go to my place of prayer and to be silent, and then I kind of know that it's Christ that I'm speaking with or listening to.
Tim said that well, the Christ in me, seeing the Christ in you.
And then applying that in your own spiritual discernment or your own listening, even in your private prayer. That's great. Thank you, Alice, for that tip. Well, Andrea, I think we're a little bit over time, so I'm going to pass it along to you, but I did want to thank every single one of you on the panel for leading us in this great conversation, and every single participant for joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret.
Before we conclude today's webinar, I invite you all to visit our website at ncea.org to see listings for additional upcoming webinars. And I hope you'll join us for the rest of the series as we move forward. On October 12th, we're going to have a new set of panelists to discuss how the content Dr. Hogan presented can be applied to the various ministries that we work in. As a reminder, we will be sending you this recorded webinar and a certificate of attendance via email along with the presentation materials. I will also include information about how to register for the rest of the series if you've not had an opportunity to do so already. Thank you, Margaret, for leading us today, and thanks to all of our panelists for sharing your expertise with our audience. It was truly a blessing. Thanks again to our sponsor, Paradisius Day, and of course to you, our audience, for the great questions and active participation. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. God bless you.
Thank you.
You.
You.